And again, I would argue that if you can solve end-to-end marketing, which is what we're doing, and making, being able to create ads rapidly, I would argue then that, one of the bottlenecks is identifying moments. So there are lots of moments that are going on around the world right now that the brands are not, or failing to put their products and services in front of people. One of the exciting things about AI is being able to identify those macro and micro moments to then allow our creatives to build campaigns rapidly to capture that moment.
I'm Maren Hunsberger, and I'm a science and tech communicator, and that means that I get to talk to really smart people about what they do. So today I'm here with Daniel Hulme, who's the CEO of Satalia, a WPP company that takes business challenges and turns them into AI-driven solutions. And today we're going to talk about AI's role in marketing. So Daniel, in this world of growing complexity where brands want to personalize their marketing, how can AI help them do that?
Well, first of all, I think there are some industries that are relatively immune to the disruption of AI, and we're going to make things faster, cheaper, better. But media marketing communications is being completely disrupted by AI. We can now create ads hundreds or potentially thousands of times faster than previously before. And so really what we're looking at is how do we apply AI to solving problems across the marketing supply chain to make sure you're getting the right ads to the right people at the right time. That's the fundamental challenge to solve for. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a huge amount of opportunity to be able to service that need, to be able to again make sure that the right brands, the right products and services are being made available to the right people.
Makes sense. So how can brands use AI tools like this to maintain brand consistency, especially if we're looking at delivering this content over different channels or even in different markets completely, like localizing the content?
Well, I guess if you look across our supply chain, there are broadly three types of activities. One is there's a creative aspect, so coming up with ideas, campaigns, etc. The second is creating content, production grade content, and then the third is then pushing that content across channels to maximize return on investment. And there is an opportunity to hyper personalize content now because of AI, but I would argue if we think about some of the ads that are memorable to you, those ads were not necessarily targeted specifically for you, but they're shared moments in communities.
Maybe so more universal.
That's right. Yeah, we have to get the balance right between personalization, which in some case makes sense, but also how can we create shared moments. There are broadly 4 underpinning AI services that need to be developed that serve those three parts of our supply chain. The first is being able to create content rapidly. We call those brand brains. I can talk about that later. The second is being able to understand how people perceive content. We call those audience brains. The third is predicting the activation, the clicks, the likes, the sales that we're going to get from that content. And the fourth is then pushing that content and optimizing that content across channels to maximize return on investment. Now, there are other AI services like creativity and identifying moments, which we can also talk about later on.
What is a brain in this context?
Brain is a bit like a human brain. It's a specialist entity that's able to do one job very well. So when we talk about brand brains, if you go to ChatGPT or DALL-E or any of these large language models and asked it to create an ad for a product, it won't really know what you're talking about. It might get the colors and things like that, but it won't understand the nuances of the brand guidelines, the tone of voice, etc. So a brand brain is an AI that's able to produce now almost production grade brand specific differentiated content. So when our creatives are coming up with ideas, they're now able to create content that is 95% good. Now, and that brain is actually made of different components. A bit like our brains, we have different lobes. I'm going to stretch the analogy here.
Love it.
We might have within that brain different specialisms. Now, actually, let me just geek out a second because I think this is important. A large language model is a little bit like a graduate.
Okay.
And you can get better results from that graduate by asking it better questions, which is prompting. Now, you won't be able to ask a perfectly good question to create an ad. So asking better questions only gets you to about 20% good. The second way of making a graduate smarter is by giving it your brand guidelines, your tone of voice, lots of examples of your imagery, etc. You ask it questions and it looks at your brand guidelines and it tries to answer the questions based on what you've given it, which again will get you to about 40% good. The next way of making a brain smart is turning that brain, that graduate, into a professor or an expert at your brand. That currently takes weeks in the AI world, and we know how long it takes human beings to go from a graduate to a professor. It takes years of training and trial and error and experimentation. What we do in WPP when we're creating brand brains is we create a consortium of professors, a professor that's an expert at your tone of voice, a professor that's an expert at your imagery, that understands your culture and your values. And the trick is, how do you get all of these different experts coordinating and collaborating to produce content that is now 95%, 100% good? So brand brains are ultimately trying to create content that is usable as ads.
You've made a brain committee. Exactly. To optimize your content.
Absolutely. In the same way, when we look at the real world and human beings, you don't typically have one human being that's able to create an ad. You need to pull together different experts to be able to create excellent content.
And how can AI tools like that help with something like brand consistency, especially when we're going across channels? Again, we're trying to personalize, and maybe we're in different delivery methods like social media, or localizing for maybe even a different market in a different place.
That's a really great question, because brand brains are not only good at creating content, you're able to test content against them to see if they align with your brand guidelines, and creating and ensuring compliance across organizations, large organizations, is very, very hard. So what we're seeing is these brains not just being used to create content, but to ensure that content is compliant. And what the exciting thing about them is they're able to tell you what you need to do to change that content to then make it compliant. So it's enabling us to create brand consistency across different jurisdictions, different products, and doing that in a very rapid way.
That's amazing. So when we talk about building an audience brain and understanding all of these things about them, where are we getting that information?
It's a really insightful question, actually, and I usually turn the question around, which is, if you had a graduate sitting next to you that you wanted to become an expert at a particular audience, what data would you get them to go and consume? And the answer is, it depends on the product and the channel that you're looking at. So if you're wanting to develop an audience brain for selling a product on Amazon, then Amazon reviews are a really great place to identify shopper barriers, how people think and feel about your product and maybe competitor products. There are also sort of horizontal data sources as well. Reddit is a fantastic source of data to understand kind of general audiences. So augmenting external horizontal data sources, as well as obviously the huge amount of data that we have in WPP on audiences, and then engaging with our kind of specialized agencies that have deep expertise in behavioral psychology, organizational psychology, to access specialist data sources, or where there isn't data available, to be able to get that data through surveys or other methods. The question really is making sure that you have the right data, and that's, I would argue, the differentiator.
Makes sense. When we're thinking about audience brains and the other kinds of brains that you mentioned, how can they be used to help predict the success of a campaign, especially if we are thinking in terms of the traditional method of a trial and error or a beta testing campaign? So
audience brains are essentially synthetic audiences that, like the focus groups, you can test content against very rapidly. Now, I guess maybe let's imagine I'm creating an ad for, let's say, a horror movie, and my assumption is that making people feel excited and scared is what's going to lead to clicks and likes and activation. Having a synthetic audience for me to be able to test content against and saying, does this make you feel excited and scared, is really the first step. And then you can use those signals as well as external signals, so other data sources like past data, to then augment and build what we call a performance brain. So the performance brain not only predicts the activation, but the power of machine learning in this case, not generative AI, but machine learning. The power of machine learning is not in just predicting the clicks and the likes and the sales. It's being able to explain why. And the terrible example that I use is if I show you an ad with a black cat, I can predict the clicks, likes, and sales. But what machine learning can do, our performance brain can do, is it can say, Daniel, if you change that from a black cat to a ginger cat, you're going to get more clicks, likes, and sales because that person likes Garfield. Now, it would have been very hard for a human being to identify that kind of complex correlation, the correlation between Garfield and more clicks and likes and sales. But if you implement it correctly, machine learning, then your performance brain can explain the world, then allow you to make better decisions.
Sure. So the AI tool can not only help you predict the performance of your suggested campaign, but can also feed back to you, hey, maybe think about changing these things about your campaign in order to have more of the desired effect.
Exactly. And you can now start to see, the power in the brains is not how the brains work in isolation, but how they come together. So the performance brain can say what you need to change in your ad, the brand brain perspective, to then create content that activates it even more.
So how can AI tools like the brains that we're talking about help brands optimize their spending across multiple platforms and maybe multiple customer touch points and still allocate all of those resources really efficiently?
So let's just kind of recap. So I guess the brand brains are primarily leveraging large language models to create content. Audience brains, again, using large language models to understand audience perception. Performance brains use machine learning to predict and explain activation. Channel brains now need to allocate content across multiple channels given constraints around budget and time and all that kind of stuff. Now, that is a completely different field in computer science. It's not generative AI, it's not machine learning, it's what traditionally would be called operations research. It's where Satalia actually has a real pedigree. And you may have heard me talk about this before. If you have 5 pieces of content to allocate to 5 channels, there are 120 possible solutions. If you have 60 pieces of content to allocate to 60 channels, there are more solutions than there are atoms in the universe. WPP have to push literally thousands of pieces of content across thousands of channels every second of every day. So being able to do that really well needs bleeding edge expertise in optimization, and so that's really what the channel brain is trying to figure out, is how do I maximize the content across these channels to increase return on investment. And then when you start to tie all of this together, how do you then optimize in flight to increase that return on investment even more?
Of course, and then feeding back into the rest of the committee of brains, where like what audiences are on which channels and how do they feel about it coming to them through that channel, and letting them work together like that.
That's right. And of course, these brains combined feed and power our end-to-end marketing operating system open. And we're now moving from a kind of a paradigm of being able to create ads in weeks or months now to being able to create ads in seconds, which raises lots of interesting challenges. How do we make sure that those ads are compliant and safe and responsible?
And then how does all of this work together to help us assess the impact of these campaigns? So the success of the campaign on different audiences through different channels.
Well, the success ultimately is in the proof of the pudding. If we can show an improvement in ROI based on previous methods, then it speaks to itself. For example, our performance brain that's been embedded into what we call our commerce studio has shown an uplift of return actually around 40%, and we as WPP we guarantee an uplift of 25%, but we're seeing uplifts of about 40%. So ultimately, I think what's really nice about AI is that we can apply the scientific method to marketing. We can test and we can show a genuine return on investment.
Sure. So you can see we've input X, we've gotten Y result. We can really measure and understand why that's happened.
Indeed. Now there are other AI services that are very important. Those 4 don't create the complete picture. I would argue that identifying emerging segments is very important. So before you even get to build an audience brain, you need to be able to identify segments. And again, that's a different type of AI. Being able to create new ideas, to ideate, to allow our creative to explore the landscape is also a different type of technology. And again, I would argue that if you can solve end-to-end marketing, which is what we're doing, and making, being able to create ads rapidly, I would argue then that, one of the bottlenecks is identifying moments. So there are lots of moments that are going on around the world right now that the brands are not or failing to put their product and services in front of people. And one of the exciting things about AI is being able to identify those macro and micro moments to then allow our creatives to build campaigns rapidly to capture that moment. I guess segmentation historically has been quite static, and what we can see now, we can apply generative AI, machine learning, again, different types of technologies, obviously our access to lots of different data sources, to not just validate those segments, but to be able to identify emerging segments. The world is rapidly evolving. There are new channels that are appearing all of the time, and understanding kind of how those audiences are reacting and growing at the end of those channels is critical. So being able to dynamically identify segments, the size of those segments, really then helps you inform the audience brains, which are then how those segments are going to respond to content.
Right, and then it can continually evolve, so you're not stuck creating content for this outdated, maybe, and static, as you say, audience segmentation model, but you get to, in real time, get that feedback that tells you, actually, here's this new audience you should be talking to.
Indeed, in some respects, segmentation is the glue that binds media, which is the kind of the pushing of the content across channels back to brand strategy. So I've got my products and my services, like what audience should I be targeting, what new emerging segments should I be targeting, and how can I be reaching them. So I think what's really exciting is that those two worlds of brand strategy and media are going to really come together.
Sure. And then once we've identified maybe even new audience segments, how do we, with these AI tools, further highly specialize and personalize content for those audience segments?
So ultimately, I think really it's about building then audience brains, and the trick, as I mentioned, is how do we make sure that we identify the right data sources to build representative audiences.
So one of the big hot button topics in this area right now is inclusivity and accessibility. And so what are some of the issues that we see in marketing and advertising with these topics, and how can AI help us overcome those?
It's something really I'm passionate about, and we've done now a number of initiatives in Satalia where we've used AI to be able to make ads and promotional materials accessible to, for example, people that are hard of hearing or visually impaired. For example, we worked with Microsoft to be able to look at a short form ad, to be able to create a narrative of what's going on in that ad, to be able to identify the gaps, and then inject commentary in those gaps that relate both to what's going on in the ad and also link it to the audio, and that then makes that content much more accessible. And that's really useful beyond those communities that might be visually impaired or hard of hearing. So ultimately, AI is going to make this content much more accessible. But of course, we also need to make sure that we're doing it in a safe and responsible way. One of the questions I always ask myself when deploying AI technologies is what happens not if it goes wrong, but what happens if it goes very right. And human beings have a bias called homophily, which is we tend to like things that look and sound like us. And if you let AI loose and to solve kind of end-to-end marketing, which is what the goal is, you might end up a situation where you're optimizing content where you have you selling to you. Now, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know if it's enforcing biases and social bubbles, and which is why we need to make sure that we now use AI to make sure we're creating safe and responsible content. And one of the things that we're also doing in WPP is we're building brains that don't just represent target audiences, but we're building brains that represent different corners of society. You can build brains that represent minority groups or political parties or newspapers or cultures, or even ad compliance claims, food compliance claims, sustainability claims. We've just built a greenwashing brain, for example, so that when we're creating content across our supply chain, we can then show it to these different representatives to make sure that we're not creating any content that might be causing harm, triggering any communities, or breaking any laws.
Sure. What does the greenwashing brain do?
So I guess it flags where an ad might be seen as making a claim about sustainability where that claim is not true.
Amazing. So it can prevent those things from going out into the world and being problematic.
Exactly, or you make the claim true or inaccurate.
Would you say that AI tools like this are allowing us to maybe bake into the workflow more these accessibility and inclusivity needs, such as captioning or hard of hearing transcription? Does it make it easier for brands to make that content?
It does. I mean, all of these tools are ultimately multimodal, which means that they are able to create imagery and text and sound, and that just means that the content can be made available to people that might have difficulties in hearing or seeing, and as I mentioned, in terms of inclusivity, we've got to make sure that we're building content that is not excluding communities, which is why these what we call ethical brains or responsible brains are really important.
Going back to the data security aspect of it, but this can also be applicable to the actual content itself. What steps should brands be taking to ensure trust, not only with their clients, but also the people that they are targeting with this advertising or marketing, even when using this AI-driven insight?
So we have to have trust in terms of the content that we've created is not violating copyright, and we have, again, an entire team, an incredibly rigorous governance structure to make sure that we are using models across our supply chain at the appropriate parts of our supply chain. Of course, we've got infrastructure to allow and make sure that data is not being leaked or being compromised in any way. I would also say that we spend a lot of time thinking about the safe and responsible use of these technologies. We've built frameworks and technologies to make sure that we're mitigating the adverse effects of these technologies, not just going wrong, but also going very right. It's something that I'm very passionate about. But the safe and responsible uses of AI are the forefront of our team's brain. We also, of course, we work with experts across WPP to make sure that we always have humans in the loop, making decisions where the AIs are not confident in making their decisions. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. It's really important to architect and ensure that you have humans in the loop.
Right. And